I'm Levi, 30 male. I live in a high-rise apartment that overlooks the city, a place I earned through long nights and a relentless focus on my career as a financial analyst. It's a quiet life, one dictated by market trends and quarterly reports. The order and logic of my job have always been a refuge from the chaotic emotional landscape of my family. For years, I believed that if I just worked hard enough and stayed out of the way, I would eventually earn the simple acknowledgement I craved from my father. But the silence on my 30th birthday was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't peaceful, it was a void. And in that void, I would uncover a betrayal that was colder and more calculated than any market downturn I had ever analyzed. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The day I turned 30 began like any other Tuesday. The alarm on my phone buzzed at 6:00 a.m. and I was at my desk by 7:15, a steaming cup of black coffee in hand. The markets were opening in a couple of hours and I needed to be ahead of them. Numbers don't have feelings, they don't play favorites. A stock is either up or down, a balance sheet either reconciles or it doesn't. This clarity was something I rarely found outside the walls of my office. My phone, usually a constant source of notifications about market alerts and work emails, was unnervingly quiet on a personal level. My friends had sent their well wishes at midnight, their messages filled with emojis and plans for a celebratory dinner that weekend. I'd smiled, sent my thanks, and went to sleep feeling a warmth that I knew would be temporary, because the calls I was really waiting for hadn't come. By 10:00 a.m., the silence from my family was palpable. My mother, Alina, was usually the first to call. She was an art teacher, a gentle soul who remembered every birthday, every small anniversary with a thoughtful card or a perfectly chosen book. But her name didn't flash across my screen. Then there was my father, Mark. A retired investment banker, he was a man who communicated in pronouncements, not conversations. A call from him was rare, but a birthday was one of the few occasions he observed. A gruff "Happy birthday, son" was the standard, a box ticked on his annual checklist. Still, its absence was a deviation from the pattern, and in my line of work, deviations were always a red flag. My older sister, Jenna, was a successful real estate agent. She lived in breadth networking, and her social media was a masterclass in self-promotion. I didn't expect a heartfelt message, but a quick text was the norm, nothing. I tried to push it aside. It was a weekday, they were busy, it was just a birthday after all. At 30, I should be past the point of needing that kind of validation. I focused on my screen, analyzing dividend yields and risk assessments. But the silence was like a low-frequency hum, a background noise that you can ignore for a while until it becomes the only thing you can hear. Lunchtime came and went. I ate a sad desk salad while scrolling through news feeds. No calls, no texts, not even a token email. I felt a familiar, dull ache in my chest. It was the feeling of being the second-place son, the afterthought. Jenna was the star. She was 2 years older, more charismatic, and had followed a career path that, while not finance, was still about high-value assets and aggressive sales, a language my father understood and admired. She closed deals, I managed risk. In his eyes, she was a predator, and I was a zookeeper. I remember one Christmas when I was 12 and Jenna was 14. I had saved up for months to buy a rare comic book, a collector's item I had obsessed over. Jenna, on the other hand, wanted a pony, not a real one but lessons at a prestigious equestrian club. My comic book cost $60, her lessons cost thousands. On Christmas morning, I unwrapped my comic and my father gave me a brief nod. When Jenna opened the envelope containing the gift certificate for her lessons, he beamed. He talked for an hour about the importance of pursuing ambitious hobbies, of learning to command a powerful animal. My comic book was never mentioned again. That was the dynamic. I was the quiet, steady one. Jenna was the dazzling, expensive one, and my father funded the dazzle. My mother would try to compensate in her own quiet ways, leaving my favorite dessert out after dinner or slipping me $20 for the movies. She loved me, I knew that, but she was a gentle current against my father's tidal wave of influence. She could offer comfort, but she couldn't change the tide. As the workday ended, I packed my briefcase, the knot in my stomach tightening. Maybe they were planning a surprise. It seemed unlikely. My family wasn't the surprise party type, but hope is a stubborn thing. I walked home, the city lights blurring around me. I kept checking my phone, my thumb hovering over my father's contact info. Should I call him? Should I be the one to remind him it was my 30th birthday? The thought was humiliating. It felt like begging for a scrap of attention. I got back to my apartment, the one I was so proud of, and it suddenly felt cavernous and empty. I dropped my keys on the counter, the clatter echoing in the silence. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the endless stream of cars below. Each one was filled with people going somewhere, meeting someone, living lives that felt more connected than mine. It was almost 9:00 p.m. The day was nearly over. The hope for a surprise had withered and died. Now it was just resignation. They had forgotten, all of them. On the day I officially left my 20s behind, the people who were supposed to be my foundation had simply forgotten I existed. I took a long sip of whiskey, the burn in my throat a welcome distraction from the cold ache in my chest. It wasn't the first time I'd felt like an invisible man in my own family, but for some reason this time felt different. It felt final. The silence wasn't just an oversight, it was a statement. And as I drained my glass, a bitter resolve began to form in my mind. If they could so easily write me out of their day, then maybe it was time I started analyzing my emotional investments with the same ruthless logic I applied to my financial ones. Some assets, I realized, simply weren't performing. The next morning, I woke up with a headache from the whiskey and a heavier feeling of resolution. I had survived my 30th birthday. The world hadn't ended, but something inside me had shifted. The need for their approval, a constant hum in the background of my life, had been replaced by a cold, quiet anger. I went through my morning routine on autopilot, the silence of the previous day still ringing in my ears. It was around 11:00 a.m. when the first crack in that silence appeared. It wasn't a phone call or a belated birthday text. It was a notification from Instagram. My sister Jenna had tagged me in a post. For a fleeting second, I thought it might be a "sorry I missed your birthday" message. My finger tapped the notification before the thought had even fully formed. The screen lit up with a vibrant, sun-drenched photo. It was a picture of Jenna, my father, and my mother, all grinning from ear to ear. Jenna was in the center, wearing running gear, a finisher's medal hanging around her neck. My father had his arm slung proudly around her shoulder, a rare, genuine smile on his face, the kind I hadn't seen directed at me in years. My mother stood beside them, her smile a little more reserved but undeniably happy. They were standing in front of a banner that read, "San Diego Marathon Finish Line." The caption was a testament to Jenna's flair for dramatic self-congratulation. "Feeling so blessed, sports medal couldn't have crushed my first marathon without my amazing support system. A huge thank you to my dad for flying all the way across the country to be my personal cheerleader, and to my mom for being her wonderful, supportive self. This one's for you guys. Red Marathon San Diego Family First Blessed." I read the caption again and again, the words blurred together, "Flew all the way across the country." My father lived in New York just like me. San Diego was a 6-hour flight. The race must have been on Sunday, maybe Monday. My birthday was Tuesday. He had flown over 2,000 miles to watch Jenna run a race that likely took place just a day or two before my 30th birthday. And he was still there. My mother, too. The timeline clicked into place with sickening precision. They hadn't forgotten my birthday. They were on a trip for Jenna. A trip that apparently made it impossible for any of them to pick up a phone for 2 minutes to call me. The silence wasn't an accident, it was a casualty of their devotion to my sister. I was, once again, collateral damage in the ongoing celebration of Jenna. But it was the tag that felt like the cruelest twist of the knife. She had tagged me. It wasn't a private message, it was a public declaration. It was a way of saying, "Look at our perfect family moment, the one you weren't a part of, but don't worry, we'll tag you so you don't miss seeing how happy we are without you." It was performative, careless, and unbelievably arrogant. My hands started to shake. I scrolled through the comments under the photo. They were a flood of congratulations for Jenna. "You're an inspiration. Go Jenna, go. Your family is beautiful." Friends, colleagues, even distant relatives had liked and commented. And there, nestled among them, was a comment from my father's account, posted just an hour ago. "Never been prouder of you, champ. Your determination is second to none." Champ, he called her champ. He had never called me anything else. Like that, I had graduated with honors, landed a competitive job at a top firm, and built a life for myself from the ground up without his help. The best I ever got was a firm handshake and a clipped, "Well done." But Jenna runs a race and she's a champ. The air in my office suddenly felt thin. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street below. Everyone was moving, going about their lives, completely unaware that my world had just tilted on its axis. The betrayal wasn't just about a forgotten birthday anymore. It was about the blatant, unapologetic demonstration of my place in the family hierarchy. I was not a priority. I was an option, and an easily discarded one at that. I thought about my father, Mark. As an investment banker, his entire life had revolved around a simple principle: you invest in assets that provide the highest return. It was clear he viewed his children the same way. Jenna, the charismatic real estate agent who moved in circles of wealth and influence, was a high-yield growth stock. I, the quiet analyst who managed risk and preached caution, was a municipal bond, safe, reliable, but boring. He had allocated his emotional capital accordingly. The anger simmering inside me began to cool, replaced by something much harder and sharper. It was the clarity of a financial analyst looking at a bad investment. For 30 years, I had been pouring my love, respect, and longing for approval into a fund that yielded nothing but disappointment. It was time to divest. But it wasn't enough to simply walk away. The analyst in me, the part of my brain that saw patterns and calculated outcomes, started to stir. There was a detail in the photo that nagged at me. It was my mother. Her smile was there, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. In the chaos of my own hurt, I had almost missed it. While my father and Jenna were radiating triumph, my mother looked tired, almost strained. There was a story there, a piece of data I was missing. And then another thought struck me, cold and logical. My father was a man of meticulous planning. A retired investment banker doesn't just fly across the country. He books flights, hotels, rental cars, he moves money, he leaves a trail, and my mother, the quiet librarian, had been swept along. Why? What was the full picture? The Instagram post was just the cover of the prospectus. I needed to see the financials. I needed to understand the full extent of this investment in Jenna. The silence on my birthday wasn't just neglect. I was starting to realize it was a cover for something else entirely. And for the first time in my life, I was going to find out what. The family I thought I knew was a portfolio of secrets, and I was about to conduct a full audit. For the next few days, I went through the motions of my life with a detached precision. I presented quarterly earnings reports, advised clients on portfolio diversification, and drank coffee at my desk. But behind the facade of the diligent financial analyst, a different kind of analysis was taking place. My mind was no longer on the stock market, it was on the family market, and I was beginning to suspect a case of insider trading. The key, I knew, was my mother. My father and Jenna were a closed loop, a self-sustaining ecosystem of mutual admiration. But my mother was different. She was observant, and more importantly, she was sentimental. She was the family's unofficial archivist, a keeper of photo albums, birthday cards, and old letters. While my father operated in the world of high-stakes finance, my mother's currency was memory and emotion. And like any good archivist, she was meticulous about her records. I called her on Friday evening. I knew they would be back from San Diego by then. I kept my tone level, a carefully constructed blend of casual curiosity and belated hurt. "Hey Mom, saw the pictures from the marathon. Looked like fun," I began. Her voice was flustered, laced with a guilt that was almost audible. "Oh Levi, honey, I am so sorry. With the travel and the race, the time difference. Your birthday just completely slipped my mind. I feel terrible." It was a weak excuse and we both knew it, but I didn't call her on it. I needed information, not a confession. "It's okay, Mom, don't worry about it. How was the trip?" "Oh, it was wonderful," she said, a little too brightly. "Jenna was just incredible. Your father was so proud, you should have seen him." "I saw the picture," I said, my voice flat. "He looked it. Must have been a last-minute trip, huh? Pretty spontaneous for Dad." There was a pause. It was brief, just a second, but it was enough. It was the pause of someone trying to remember the official story. "Oh, you know your father," she said, her voice regaining its manufactured cheerfulness. "When he gets an idea in his head," Jenna mentioned she was nervous and he just wanted to be there for her. Another piece of data that didn't fit. My father wasn't spontaneous. He planned his vacations a year in advance. He was a man who rebalanced his own portfolio every quarter on the exact same day. Spontaneous wasn't in his vocabulary. "That was nice of him," I said, letting the lie hang in the air. We talked for a few more minutes about pleasantries, her art classes, my work, before I got to the real reason for my call. "Hey Mom, this is random, but I'm trying to find some old financial documents for a mortgage pre-approval. I think I left a box of old bank statements at the house years ago. Would you mind if I came by tomorrow to look for them in the attic?" It was a plausible lie. My parents still lived in the sprawling suburban house I grew up in. The attic was a dusty treasure trove of forgotten things, a place my father hadn't set foot in for at least a decade. "Of course, sweetie," she said, relieved to have a task, a way to be helpful. "Come for lunch, I'll make your favorite." The next day, I drove to my childhood home. As I walked through the door, my mother enveloped me in a hug that was heavy with unspoken apology. My father was in his study, the door pointedly closed. Over lunch, my mother chattered nervously about the marathon, about Jenna's amazing time, about the beautiful weather in San Diego. I nodded and smiled, playing the part of the forgiving son. After the plates were cleared, I headed for the attic. "I'll just be an hour or so," I said. The attic was exactly as I remembered it, hot, stuffy, and smelling of old paper and cedar. Boxes were stacked everywhere, labeled in my mother's neat cursive. Levi's schoolwork, Jenna's trophies, Christmas decorations. The box I was looking for wasn't labeled Levi's bank statements. It was a series of matching file boxes tucked away in a dusty corner labeled simply with years, 2020, 2021, 2022. These were my mother's records. My mother, for all her gentle artistic temperament, had an incredibly organized mind. Every year, she would collect important family documents, receipts for major purchases, insurance policies, tax forms, and file them away. My father, with his typical arrogance, dismissed it as her little hobby. He had his own complex system of digital files and offshore accounts, I was sure. He would never imagine that the real records, the ones that told the true story, were kept in simple cardboard boxes in the attic. I started with the most recent box. Inside, among the utility bills and car repair receipts, I found what I was looking for, a folder labeled Travel. It contained the flight confirmations for the San Diego trip. I scanned the details. They hadn't been booked last minute. They had been booked 3 months in advance. The trip wasn't a spontaneous decision. It was a meticulously planned event that had been on the calendar for a quarter of a year. A planned event that just so happened to fall directly over my 30th birthday. It wasn't that they forgot, they had actively scheduled over it. My heart hammered in my chest, a mixture of validation and disgust, but that wasn't all. Tucked into the same folder was a receipt from a high-end jewelry store in San Diego dated the day before my birthday. The purchase was for a custom diamond tennis bracelet. The price was staggering, more than my first car had cost. It was a gift, obviously for Jenna, to celebrate her marathon. But the real discovery, the one that made the air go out of my lungs, was in a different folder. It was labeled Property. Inside was a thick sheaf of papers related to Jenna's latest real estate venture. She was flipping a house, a big one. The kind of project that required a huge amount of upfront capital. And stapled to the back of the property deed was a document I recognized instantly, a gift letter. It was a legal statement confirming that a large sum of money had been given as a gift, not a loan, for the purposes of securing a mortgage. The gift was for $250,000. The donor was my father, Mark. I sat back on my heels, the dusty floorboards creaking beneath me. This was the hidden ledger. This was the real balance sheet of our family. My father hadn't just flown across the country for a marathon. He had flown there to finalize a massive financial injection into Jenna's career. The trip, the celebration, the expensive gift, it was all part of a package deal. It was an investment. And then I saw it, the final piece of the puzzle. At the bottom of the gift letter was a line for the date of the funds transfer. The transfer was scheduled to go through on my birthday. The very day they couldn't find 2 minutes to call me, my father was busy wiring my sister $250,000. The silence on my phone was no longer just a sign of neglect. It was the sound of a major transaction taking place behind my back. My birthday had been ignored because it was an inconvenient detail in the middle of a much larger, more important event. They weren't just celebrating Jen. No, they were funding her, and they were doing it in secret. I carefully put the documents back, my mind racing. A financial analyst is trained to see the story behind the numbers. The story here was one of gross imbalance. It was a story of favoritism so extreme it had been hidden, lied about, and papered over with marathon medals and Instagram posts. My father wasn't just investing in Jenna, he was creating a dynasty with her at the center, and he was using family funds to do it. The question that now burned in my mind was, which funds exactly? Was this his money to give? The analyst in me smelled something more than just favoritism. I smelled fraud. Leaving my parents' house that day felt like stepping out of a fog and into a world of stark, ugly clarity. The quiet drive back to the city was a blur. My mind was a flurry of numbers and dates, connecting the dots of a picture I never wanted to see. The $250,000 gift to Jenna wasn't just an act of favoritism. It was a move on a strategic financial chessboard, and I had been deliberately excluded from the game. My father, Mark, had always been secretive about his finances. He came from the old school of Wall Street, where wealth was a private matter, a tool to be wielded, not discussed. He had set up trust funds for both Jenna and me when we were born, but the terms were opaque. He was the sole trustee, and he always referred to them vaguely as your future. He'd given me the impression that they were modest nest eggs, intended to be accessed much later in life, perhaps for a down payment on a house or for our own children's education. He'd preached financial prudence to me my entire life, emphasizing the importance of building my own wealth through hard work, not handouts. The trust is a safety net, not a trampoline, he used to say. Now that sermon felt like the highest form of hypocrisy. He hadn't just given Jenna a trampoline, he'd given her a rocket ship, funded by a source I was beginning to suspect was not entirely his to command. The first step for any analyst is to gather all available data. My access to my own trust fund documents was limited by my father's design. However, there was one loophole he hadn't counted on: my mother. While my father managed the investments, my mother, in her role as the family archivist, received and filed the annual statements. He saw them as junk mail, simple formalities. She saw them as records to be kept. I went back to the attic files in my mind, visualizing the labels on her boxes. If the gift to Jenna came from a family asset, there had to be a paper trail. I needed to see those statements. Getting back into the attic without raising suspicion would be difficult. I needed a better pretext. The opportunity came a week later. My mother called, her voice still laced with that gentle, anxious guilt. She was cleaning out the garage and wanted to know if I wanted my old bicycle. It was the perfect excuse. "Actually, Mom," I said, my voice steady, "while I'm there, I think I left another box of documents in the attic. Some old tax returns, I need them for my accountant." Another plausible lie. My life was becoming a web of them, but I felt no remorse. I was simply leveraging my own assets, in this case my reputation as the responsible, organized son. That Saturday, I found myself back in the hot, stuffy attic. This time I knew exactly what I was looking for. I located the file box labeled Financials Trusts. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the lid. Inside, filed neatly by year, were the annual statements for two separate trusts, the Levi Miller Trust and the Jenna Miller Trust. I pulled out the most recent statements for both and laid them side by side on a dusty trunk. My eyes scanned the pages, my brain automatically processing the data. The portfolio compositions were nearly identical, a conservative mix of blue-chip stocks, mutual funds, and bonds. For years, their growth had been steady and parallel, until the last quarter. On my trust statement, the total asset value was roughly what I expected it to be. On Jenna's, however, there was a single massive transaction dated just before the San Diego trip. It was a liquidation of assets, stocks, bonds, everything, totaling just over $250,000. That was the source of the gift. My father hadn't given Jenna money from his personal accounts. He had cashed out a huge portion of her trust fund. At first, a wave of relief washed over me. It was her money, not mine. The favoritism was still there, but at least it wasn't theft. But then the analyst in me kicked in again. Something was wrong. Why the secrecy? Why the elaborate lies about a spontaneous trip? If he was simply giving Jenna her own money, why not just say so? He was the trustee, he had the legal authority. I started digging deeper, pulling out statements from previous years. I laid them out in chronological order, creating a timeline of the trust's performance. And that's when I saw the pattern. For the past 5 years, my father had been actively managing the trusts, but not in the way a normal trustee would. He was making unusually frequent trades, moving money between assets with a high-risk appetite that was completely inappropriate for a long-term trust fund. But the strange part was the imbalance. The risky, high-yield trades were happening almost exclusively within my trust. Jenna's portfolio remained relatively stable, conservative. He was using my trust as his personal venture capital fund, chasing aggressive returns while keeping her safe. Then I saw the transfers. Periodically, after a successful, high-risk trade in my account had yielded a significant profit, a portion of that profit would be transferred from my trust to Jenna's. The transfers were disguised, routed through a holding company I didn't recognize, but the dates and amounts lined up perfectly. He was taking the profits generated from the risks he took with my money and using them to bolster her fund. The full picture slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. My father, the retired investment banker, had been using my inheritance as his personal slush fund to play the market. He took the risks with my capital, and when he won, he siphoned the profits to his favored child, artificially inflating her safe investment. The $250,000 wasn't just her money. It was money that had been, in large part, generated by the risks he had taken with mine. He had effectively been stealing from me for years, a slow, methodical transfer of wealth from the safe bond to the growth stock. The silence on my birthday wasn't about them being busy. The secrecy around the trip wasn't about a simple gift. It was all a cover-up for the final stage of his plan. He had liquidated Jenna's trust, a trust artificially inflated by my own, so she could get her big payout before anyone was the wiser. He was cashing out his favorite stock at its peak. I sat there in the dusty silence of the attic, surrounded by the evidence of a decade-long financial betrayal. The forgotten birthday was just a symptom of a much deeper disease. It was never just about a lack of love or attention. It was a calculated business decision. In the cold, hard numbers of my father's world, I was not a son. I was an asset to be leveraged. My anger was cold and absolute. This wasn't just about family drama anymore. This was about financial malfeasance. As a trustee, he had a fiduciary duty to act in my best interest. What he had done was not just unethical, it was illegal. The investment banker in him had forgotten one crucial rule: every transaction leaves a paper trail, and the financial analyst in me was going to follow it all the way to the end. He had made a career of calculating risk. He was about to find out he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The drive back to my apartment was a study in controlled rage. The numbers, dates, and transfer records from the trust statements were seared into my brain. I had taken pictures of every relevant document with my phone, creating a digital dossier of my father's betrayal. He had treated my inheritance like his personal trading account, a source of risk capital to fund his preferred investment, my sister. The analyst in me was appalled by the sheer audacity and recklessness of his actions. But the son in me was broken. When I got home, I didn't pour a whiskey. I opened my laptop. Anger, I knew, was a volatile asset. It could lead to rash decisions and emotional outbursts. I needed to channel it into something cold, logical, and irrefutable. I needed a plan. My father operated in a world of contracts, clauses, and consequences. I would meet him on his own turf. For the next 2 weeks, I became obsessed. My evenings were no longer spent decompressing from work, but were instead dedicated to a forensic audit of my family's finances. I used my professional skills to cross-reference the trust statements with public records and property databases. I built a spreadsheet so detailed it could have been submitted in a court of law. Every illicit transfer, every risky trade made with my funds, every dollar of profit skimmed off the top and funneled to Jenna's trust. It was all there, color-coded and annotated. The picture that emerged was even worse than I had initially thought. My father had used the profits from my trust to help Jenna with the down payment on her first condo 5 years ago. He had used it to pay off her luxury car loan. The $250,000 gift for her house-flipping venture was just the latest and most egregious example of a long-standing, systematic transfer of wealth. He hadn't just been patting her nest egg. He had been actively funding her lifestyle at my expense. During my research, I delved into the legal intricacies of fiduciary duty and trust law. What my father had done was a clear breach of his responsibilities as a trustee. It was a textbook case of self-dealing and unjust enrichment. I could sue him. The evidence was overwhelming. An ugly public court battle would destroy what was left of our family, but it would also expose him for what he was. But as I considered this path, another thought began to take shape. A lawsuit would be messy and protracted. It would give him the opportunity to play the victim, to paint me as a greedy, ungrateful son. My mother would be caught in the crossfire, a casualty of a war she didn't start. There had to be a cleaner way. A way to achieve justice that was as precise and devastating as a surgeon's scalpel. The answer lay not in what he had done, but in what he was planning to do. My father was 62. A man like him, obsessed with wealth and legacy, would undoubtedly have a meticulously crafted will. He would want to control his assets even from beyond the grave. And that's where I realized I had leverage. I needed to see that will, but how? My parents' legal documents were likely kept in a safe deposit box or with their lawyer. Access was impossible. Then I remembered something from years ago. My father had a home safe hidden behind a false panel in his study. He used it for important papers, as he used to say. I had seen him open it once as a teenager. I still remembered the sequence of numbers. It was my sister's birthday. The irony was so thick I could taste it. Getting into the house again was the challenge. I couldn't use another forgotten documents excuse. This time I used my mother's love for art as my key. I called her and told her I had an old college friend in town who was a curator and was interested in seeing her paintings. My mother, who rarely showed her work to anyone, was flattered and flustered. She immediately agreed to host a small dinner. It was manipulative and I hated myself for it, but the stakes were too high. The night of the dinner, I was a bundle of nerves. My friend, who was actually a junior analyst from my firm sworn to secrecy, played his part perfectly, asking my mother insightful questions about her brushstrokes and use of color. While he kept my parents occupied in the living room, I excused myself to use the restroom. My heart pounded as I slipped into my father's study. The panel was right where I remembered it. I slid it open, revealing the cold, gray metal of the safe. My fingers, slick with sweat, punched in the numbers: Jenna's birthday. The safe clicked open. Inside were stacks of documents, property deeds, investment certificates, and a thick blue folder labeled Last Will and Testament. My hands shook as I pulled it out. I quickly took photos of every single page with my phone. The document was dense with legal jargon, but my eyes scanned for the key sections: the distribution of assets. What I found made the blood drain from my face. The will was a final, posthumous monument to his favoritism. Jenna was to inherit the family home, his entire stock portfolio, and the contents of a private investment account I never even knew existed. She was the sole beneficiary of his legacy. And me, I was to be given the remaining contents of my trust fund, the very fund he had been plundering for years, and a sentimental token, his collection of antique maps. The will even included a condescending clause. To my son Levi, I leave the tools of exploration, hoping they inspire him to find a path as successful as the one his sister has forged. It was a final slap in the face, a parting shot from a man who saw me as a failure. But then, as I read further, I found it, the thing that would change everything. It was a single, overlooked clause deep in the boilerplate legal text. The in terrorem clause, also known as a no-contest clause. It stipulated that if any beneficiary were to formally challenge the will's validity in court, that beneficiary would be automatically disinherited, receiving nothing at all. This was a standard legal protection designed to prevent frivolous lawsuits. But my father, in his arrogance, had made a critical error. The clause was designed to protect the will as written, but the will itself was based on a fraudulent foundation. He had structured his entire estate around the assumption that the assets he was bequeathing were legitimately his to give and that the trusts were as they appeared on paper. A plan sharp and brilliant crystallized in my mind. I didn't need to challenge the will. I needed to challenge the assets before they ever became part of the estate. My lawsuit wouldn't be against the will, it would be against Mark Miller, the trustee, for breach of fiduciary duty. I would sue him for the money he had stolen from my trust with interest and for damages. If I won, and with the evidence I had, it was almost certain I would, the court would order him to pay me back. To do that, he would have to liquidate his own assets, the stock portfolio, the private investment account, maybe even the family home. He would have to dismantle the very inheritance he had mised to Jenna, all to settle a debt to me that he had created in secret. By the time he passed away, the estate he had so carefully constructed for his champ would be a hollowed-out shell. Jenna would inherit what was left, which would be next to nothing, and if she or my father tried to challenge my claim by referencing the will, they would be fighting the wrong battle. I wasn't contesting my inheritance. I was reclaiming stolen property. My father had built a financial house of cards. I was about to pull out the foundation. I placed the will back in the safe, my hands no longer shaking. I walked out of the study with a chilling sense of calm. The game was no longer about seeking his approval. It was about a final accounting. The following weeks were a blur of quiet, methodical preparation. I retained a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense man who specialized in trust and estate litigation. I walked him through the mountain of evidence I had compiled, the doctored trust statements, the hidden transfers, the timeline of my father's financial malfeasance, and the pages of his will. My lawyer, a man not easily impressed, listened in silence, his expression growing more grim with each document I presented. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and looked at me. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "this is not just a breach of fiduciary duty. This is a surgical, long-term pattern of financial abuse. The evidence is ironclad. We won't just win, we will dictate the terms of the settlement." He confirmed my strategy. By suing my father directly for his actions as a trustee, we would bypass the will's no-contest clause entirely. The suit would be a private matter, a claim against his current assets, not a challenge to his future estate. He had built a firewall to protect his will, but I was going to burn down the forest around it. The plan was to strike without warning. We drafted the lawsuit, a document that detailed every single illicit transaction, every violation of his legal duties, complete with dates, amounts, and account numbers. It was a precise and damning indictment of the man he was behind the closed doors of his study. The final piece of the plan was the setting. I didn't want this to explode in a lawyer's office or a sterile courtroom. This needed to be personal. It needed to happen in the heart of the family, the place where all the lies had been cultivated. I asked my mother to host a family dinner. I told her I wanted to clear the air, to put the unfortunate misunderstanding about my birthday behind us once and for all. She was thrilled, believing it was a gesture of reconciliation. My father and Jenna, I was told, were pleased by my maturity. They had no idea they were accepting an invitation to their own financial reckoning. The night of the dinner, I felt a strange sense of calm. The anger that had been simmering for months had cooled into a hard, diamond-like resolve. I arrived at my childhood home, a place that held so many ghosts of disappointment, feeling like a stranger. Jenna was already there, holding a glass of wine, regaling my parents with a story about a massive commission she had just earned. "The market is just on fire," she said, her voice bright and confident. "You have to be aggressive. You have to know what you want and take it." My father beamed at her. "That's my girl," he said, clapping her on the shoulder. "A killer instinct, you inherited that from me." I watched them from the doorway, this perfect little club of two, and felt nothing but a distant pity. They were celebrating a victory paid for with stolen funds. We sat down to dinner. The conversation was strained. My mother tried to fill the silence with small talk, but the air was thick with unspoken tension. Finally, after the main course had been served, my father turned to me, a magnanimous look on his face. Levi's, he began, I hear you wanted to talk. I'm glad. Your mother was worried, but I knew you'd come around. Family is family. I placed my fork down, my hands steady. You're right, I said, my voice even. I do want to talk, but not about my birthday. I reached into my briefcase, which I had placed by my chair, and pulled out a single, thick envelope. I slid it across the polished dining room table. It stopped directly in front of my father's plate. What's this? He asked, his brow furrowing. It's a copy of a lawsuit, I replied calmly. Filed this afternoon. It's a full accounting of your time as the trustee for my inheritance. The change in the room was instantaneous. The blood drained from my father's face. Jenna let out a nervous laugh. A lawsuit? Levi, what kind of joke is this? It's not a joke, I said, my eyes locked on my father. It's a balance sheet. It details 15 years of unauthorized high-risk trades using my trust capital. It lists every single transfer of profits from my fund to Jenna's. It includes the $250,000 you liquidated from her artificially inflated trust to fund her real estate business, the real reason you were in San Diego. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Jenna's face went from confident to confused to horrified as the implications of my words sank in. My father snatched the envelope, his hands trembling as he tore it open. He scanned the first page, his face turning a mottled shade of red. This is outrageous, he stammered. This is a private family matter. It stopped being a family matter when you started committing fraud, I said, my voice like ice. As my trustee, you had a legal and fiduciary duty to act in my best interest. Instead, you used my money as your personal hedge fund and funneled the winnings to your favorite child. You stole from me, Dad, systematically, for years. Jenna looked at my father, her eyes wide with panic. Dad, what is he talking about? You said the money was an advance on my inheritance. He was advancing you my inheritance, I corrected her. The lawsuit demands full repayment of all misappropriated funds, plus punitive damages and legal fees. The total comes to just under $1.7 million. Silence, the only sound was my father's ragged breathing. You can't do this, he finally whispered, his voice cracking. It will ruin me. You ruined yourself, I said. You made a bad investment, you wagered my future on your favoritism and you lost. The lawsuit is airtight. My lawyer is confident we will win. To pay the judgment, you will have to liquidate your stock portfolio, your private accounts, maybe even this house, everything you've earmarked for Jenna's perfect future. I then turned to my sister. And Jenna, once that money is clawed back, the source of funds for your property venture will be gone. The bank will call your loan. You should probably talk to a lawyer of your own. Jenna stared at me, her face pale. The self-assured real estate mogul was gone, replaced by a frightened woman who was just beginning to understand the depth of her father's deception. Finally, I looked at my mother. Her face was a mask of grief. I'm sorry, Mom, I said, my voice softening for the first time. I truly am, but I can't let this stand. My father slammed his fist on the table. You ungrateful brat, after everything I've done for you. What have you done? I asked, standing up. You ignored me, you belittled me, and you stole from me. You talk about killer instincts. Well, here's one for you. I'm not contesting your will. I have no interest in your antique maps. I'm simply collecting a debt. Your will and its no contest clause are completely irrelevant here. You can leave Jenna whatever you want. But by the time I'm done, there won't be anything left to leave. I picked up my briefcase and walked to the door. I paused and looked back at the shattered tableau of my family, my father shaking with rage and fear, my sister weeping silently, my mother looking utterly lost. You have 72 hours to have your lawyer contact mine to discuss a settlement, I said. Otherwise, we proceed. This is the final accounting. I walked out the door and didn't look back. The echo of silence that had started on my birthday had finally been filled with the sound of a dynasty crumbling to dust. The aftermath of that dinner was not a fiery explosion but a slow, controlled demolition. As I had predicted, my father's lawyer contacted mine within 48 hours. There was no blustering, no denial. They knew the evidence was insurmountable. My father, the master of risk assessment, had finally found himself in a position with zero leverage. His only move was to mitigate the damage. The settlement negotiations were swift and brutal. My legal team, armed with the irrefutable paper trail I had provided, was relentless. We didn't settle for a portion of what was owed. We demanded every single dollar that had been misappropriated from my trust, compounded with a decade's worth of interest plus all legal fees. The final number was just shy of $2 million. To meet the obligation, my father was forced to do exactly what I had predicted. He had to liquidate the majority of his personal stock portfolio, the one he had spent a lifetime building. He had to drain his private investment accounts. The legacy he had so carefully curated for Jenna was dismantled piece by piece to repay the son he had written off. It was the ultimate irony. In his attempt to secure his favorite child's future, he had guaranteed its ruin. The family home was ultimately spared, but only because my mother, in a surprising show of strength I had never seen before, put her foot down. She told my father that the house was her home too, and she would not be forced out of it because of his deceit. To save it, he had to cash in his pension and take out a second mortgage. He would spend the rest of his retirement paying for his betrayal. Jenna's world imploded, as I had warned with the Source O. Her down payment now legally designated as stolen funds, the bank that had financed her house-flipping project immediately recalled her loan. Unable to cover the massive debt, she was forced into bankruptcy. The house was seized, her real estate license was suspended due to the financial misconduct, and her reputation was destroyed. The golden child, who had flown so high on wings funded by deceit, came crashing back to earth. She ended up moving back into my parents' mortgaged home, her career in shambles. I did not see my father or my sister during this time. All communication was through our lawyers. But my mother called me once about a month after the settlement was finalized. Her voice was quiet, filled with a profound sadness. "He's a different person, Levi," she said, referring to my father. "He's broken, all that pride, all that arrogance, it's just gone. He just sits in his study all day, staring at the walls." "What did you expect, Mom?" I asked, not unkindly. His life's work was building a legacy for Jenna. That legacy was built on a lie, and now it's gone. "I know," she whispered. I never knew the extent of it. I'm so sorry, Levi. I was blind to it for so long." "You saw what you were allowed to see," I told her. He made sure of that. We talked for a while longer. She didn't ask me for anything, didn't ask me to forgive him. She just wanted to talk, to reconnect with the son she felt she had lost. I realized then that my relationship with her could be salvaged. It would be different, more honest and stripped of the pretense of a happy family, but it could exist. My relationships with my father and sister, however, were severed assets. They were liabilities I had cut from my portfolio. I had no interest in reconciliation. Trust, once broken to that degree, can never be fully restored. My revenge was never about shouting or screaming. It was about the cold, quiet enforcement of consequences. It was about balance. For my entire life, the scales of our family had been tipped impossibly in one direction. I had simply balanced them.